How are you all today? It's a beautiful cloudy day out. Oh, my keyboard's freaking out. All right, if you all would stand for the reading of the word this morning, we're going to be turning to John chapter 18. We're going to read verses 36 through 38. John chapter 18, verses 36 through 38. John 18, 36 through 38, reading from the ESV, or the English Standard Version. And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to me." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Amen. You may now be seated. Yeah, apparently. Just let it play. We'll see what he says. You may be seated. Thank you, God. Are all phones now muted? Everybody got that? Ringers toned down. It's one of those things in modern life that I think everybody now faces at some point in time. At some point in time, you're going to be the person whose ringer goes off, whose phone does something, whose tablet does something, and you're going to be the person scrambling desperately. So we've all been there. Speaking of scrambling, so yesterday at about 5:30, I get a call from Chad. I was working on my Suburban, replacing a brake line. I got my head underneath the hood, and I get a call, and it's Chad, and I take the call while my head's stuck next to the wheel, and he's like, "Hey, I got a favor to ask." I'm like, "What's that?" And he says, "Can you preach tomorrow?" Like, tomorrow? It's 5:30 on Saturday. He's like, "Yeah, I'm not feeling well. I might not be able to make it there. Can you put something together?" I'm like, "Okay." So generally, when it's like one of the worst things you can get is like that call, "Hey, can you please do something right away?" And normally preparing a sermon is something that you want to spend a lot of time in prayer in, which I did, a lot of time between then and now, and a lot of time preparing and everything. But I did sleep, so my apologies if this sounds like the incoherent ramblings of some lunatic, but it's because these are things that are on my mind a lot, and so it was time to. I figured it was a good opportunity to share some of those. So if you're listening and you're thinking, he made some points, but I'm really not sure where he was going with all that, please come and talk to me afterward, and maybe I'll be able to explain it a little bit better then. But today we're going to talk about Pilate's question. What is truth? Jesus says, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world." And he says, "My purpose is to bear witness to the truth, and everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate says, "That's an interesting thing that you bring up, Jesus. What is truth?" Well, the concept of truth is something that people have been discussing and thinking about really for all of human history. What does truth mean? What is reality? In the Greek and Roman pantheons and the Egyptian pantheons, they had goddesses of truth. In Greece, her name was Aletheia. She was created by Prometheus. And so she was supposed to be the embodiment of truth and justice. In the Roman pantheon, the person was known as Veritas. So you might have seen that name, Veritas. That means truth in Latin. In Egypt, they also had a goddess of truth, and she was the goddess of truth and justice and morality, and her name was Ma'at. Interesting that, I think it's very interesting that in all those pantheons, it was always a goddess of truth. I don't know what that means, but I just thought it was interesting. So draw whatever conclusions you may from that. Other than all men are liars. Don't draw that conclusion. That would be a bad conclusion. When we're talking about truth, we have to kind of think about, what does it mean? So we start off with a definition. And so a definition of truth that's often given is, truth is what is corresponding to reality, what is universally and objectively known, as opposed to what is wrong or false or fictitious. We have the phrase where it used to be used a lot more, where something has a ring of truth. right? It sounds like it's true. It sounds believable. It sounds plausible anyway. Humans have an innate sense of truth and wrong, of right and wrong, of truth and error. It's something that we as people seem to have, that everybody just kind of has. We tend to recognize, we want to know what truth is. That's why all these ancient religions had these goddesses or these personifications of truth. That's why people have been talking about truth really for as long as people have been thinking about things. If we look at ancient Greek philosophy, we go back to Plato and Aristotle, and the question of truth was a really big deal for those guys. Because the question of truth relates to the question of what is reality, or what is real, or the other question is, why are we here, right? So truth and reality and our purpose are all intertwined with each other, and that's why a lot of people have been talking about those and thinking about them. Plato had made up a whole story about what he called was an allegory of the cave. And some of you may have heard this story. So Plato's understanding of truth and reality was he described humanity as being like a group of prisoners that are chained up in a cave. And we've been chained up in this cave ever since we were infants. And we've never known anything other than the cave. And we're chained in such a way that we can only look at the back of the cave. So Plato's perspective was that all people are like looking at the back of the cave. And then the real world is happening outside the mouth of the cave behind us, with light on the other side of them. So all we're seeing are shadows. And so Plato would talk about, and he says, really what we see, what we experience in the world isn't real. It's just a shadow of the real things that are happening around us. So he called that world, the one that happened outside the cave, the world of forms. And he was like, so we as humans, we have very limited understandings of what truth is. So it's kind of like we're just looking at a shadow. And other people have talked about that a lot more and trying to understand what truth means. A lot of philosophers talk about what does truth mean, and we're going to get a little bit further into what truth means in philosophy and how some people have understood it. But truth is that objective reality, but truth also means what we believe to be true. Now that's a much more limited definition of truth. It's not contrary to the first one, but it's a much more limited one. Like for instance, in a court of law, when somebody is about to testify, they place their hand, well, it used to be a Bible, now we just ask people to swear on whatever. But they're asked, do you swear to tell the truth? Come on, say it with me. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? So that's what testimony is supposed to be. Whatever you understand the truth to be, and they expect you to say all of that you believe. How many of you remember the movie A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise? So Tom Cruise is asking the witness on the stage, who's a Marine colonel, and he says, the Marine colonel's like, what do you want from me? And he says, I want to know the truth. And then there's the classic line he responds, you can't handle the truth, because he's hiding why somebody else was murdered and everything, and it's a whole military thing where, they hide all sorts of stuff, what Hollywood tends to do with military movies. But he says, I won't tell you the truth because you can't handle it. You can't understand it. What the truth is far too complicated for you to understand. And that's a concept that a lot of people have kind of come to in their conclusions when they're thinking about truth is, like Plato, I don't seem to be able to really grasp or apprehend all of what truth means because it seems to be more than what I can understand. One of the reasons that we believe that is because, going back to that court thing, personal testimony or what we see can be incorrect, right? What we think we see and how our brain interprets that might be different things. So that's why when people give a personal testimony, somebody examines them and cross-examines them to try to help understand what it is that they actually believe. And the interesting about what we believe and our perspective is colored by our opinion of the people that are involved. This is actually something that a lot of people are talking about with morality, is that we tend to judge what we see based on our preconceptions of who is involved. So for instance, let's say that somebody sees a person reaching down into a river, holding on to the head of a person who's bobbing up and down under the water. We could understand, one, if we saw a person and we're like, oh, I know that's a bad person, that they're trying to drown the person that's under the water. Or if we think highly of them, we might immediately draw the conclusion that they're reaching down into the water and trying to grab them and pull them out. They look to be the same, but it's based on our interpretation, it's based on our impression, maybe our preconceptions of the people that are involved. So we recognize that the truth that we see is limited by what we know and what we're already thinking about things. And that truth, our truth is, and I say our truth, and I use that with air quotes because there is absolute truth, but we're going to talk about how we're limited by what it means. So that truth that's there could be right or could be wrong. Like that person says, oh, I was absolutely certain they were trying to drown them. Well, they were actually trying to save them, but your impression was wrong. So we as people recognize that when we're trying to perceive truth or trying to understand the world around us, that we have limitations. Another thing is that people could tell the truth about what they believe, but be factually incorrect. So some statements about truth, specifically about beliefs, could be simultaneously right and wrong because of what they're saying. So take, for example, a following conversation that I may have with my kids. I come home from work, and I say, where is your mother? And one child might respond with, well, I think she's in the kitchen. And then another child might respond with, I think she's in the bedroom, or I think she's in the laundry room. Now, those statements of what they believe to be true are true statements because they're making statements about what they believe. Each child believes different things. One child believes she's in the kitchen, another one in the bedroom, another one in the laundry room, or whatever. So the statement about what they believe is true, but their statements about their belief may or may not correspond to the actual reality of where their mother is. Their mother may be in the backyard, or she may be somewhere else. So one of them may be right and the others be wrong. What'd you say? Where is she not? The mother is saying, I'm not in the kitchen. I don't know. So their statements may or may not correspond to reality. One of them could be correct, or they all could be wrong. But their statements about what they believe to be true are accurate, but they may not correspond to that actual reality. And this type of confusion is leading a lot of people in the modern day to talk about your truth and my truth. We hear that a lot in modern civilization. Well, that's your truth. Or, well, this is my truth. And the thing is because we're talking about when people say that, God bless you, they're talking about what they believe to be true. But it's a limited truth, if it will, because they're only able to refer to their particular beliefs. And their particular beliefs may or may not actually correspond to reality, to the absolute truth. In fact, some people, when talking about truth and talking about absolute truth, have come to the conclusion that there's no way you could know absolute truth. Some people will say, well, with all these problems that we as people have, you can't actually know absolute truth. And there's a way to respond to that, a biblical way to respond to it. So going back to philosophy, this question of truth, some people have said, well, if we're really going to know truth, we have to think about how we can actually perceive it, because it's so complicated. Let's see if we can figure out ways to understand truth. So in the early 1700s, there was a British philosopher by the name of David Hume, and he came up with two things that he said how we know truth. He said, I think we can absolutely decide there's ways we know truth, and here's two tests. And the first thing was, he said, we can know something is true if it's mathematically reasoned or if it's definition. So 2 + 2 = 4. We can know that's true because we can, put the little blocks on the table, and we put 2 blocks and 2 blocks, and we end up with 4 blocks. We can see that. We can prove it. He says those are the types of things we can know are true. Or he said, we can also know things that are true if they are definition. So a triangle has 3 sides. True or false? True, because that's the definition of a triangle. If you were to have a 4-sided triangle, you would have a square, right? So it can't happen. So because it's the definition, it has to be true. True definitions are involved. So that was his first way of understanding truth. He says if it's mathematical or if it's definitional, that's one way of knowing. And then the second thing he said, this is the only other way we can know truth. He said a truth claim can only be known to be true if it could be verified empirically through our 5 senses. He said, so if you can test it and prove that it's true and verify it, then you can prove that it's true. So for David Hume, everything outside of those 2 methods was determined to be not possibly true. Well, that puts a lot of limitations on things. Another philosopher of that same time, a few years later, by the name of Immanuel Kant, was thinking about things that Hume said, and he was a little bit more skeptical because he realized that that Hume had said some things that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. So Kant said, well, I think Plato was onto something. Kant said, well, we can't actually really know what truth is. We can't really know the truth about anything because we just have our perceptions. He had these terms, one he called noumena, which he said that's the real world, which Plato referred to as the world of forms. He says that's the real world, and then there's phenomena. These are the things that we see, but the two aren't the same. So you can't actually know truth because you can't perceive it. He says everything is being processed through our senses, which is what Hume said, but Kant really didn't trust his senses like Hume did. So he said, well, I don't think we can really know truth at all. Well, so what do you end up with a world where you have guys like Hume and Kant, who are, from my understanding of philosophy, probably two of the most influential people in the last few hundred years in modern philosophy? What do you end up with if their philosophy is taken by a whole bunch of other people? Well, if they're Humean, or following David Hume, he was a naturalist. He said, the only things that we can believe are the things we can put our hands on, the things we can touch, the things we can prove. Well, if you're a naturalist, and you can only go with that, well then, by definition, his definition, everything that's supernatural can't possibly be true. Because he ruled out that as a possibility of reality. So then, when we're actually talking about a God who is spirit, and we say that we worship him in spirit, we also say we worship him in truth, which comes up. He says, nope, it can't happen. Hume was specifically about God being a concept. He was opposed to miracles. And so the problem that we now have in the world is that a lot of people look at the world through this naturalistic view. They believe only things that can be proven, only things that can be touched could possibly be true, which is really the foundation that we have for modern science. A lot of modern scientists believe, well, hey, if it's not material, if I can't prove it, sorry, it can't be true. Which is flawed because, see, there's a fundamental flaw in Hume's reasoning. Hume said, we can only know something to be true if we can prove it, like mathematically or by definition, or if we can prove it with our senses. So how did Hume know that to be true? Hume's proposition that we can only know truth by what's material or what we can prove mathematically is neither material, nor can it be proven mathematical. So his whole premise is flawed. Sorry, David, you can't be right. You literally can't be right because your own hypothesis refutes itself. It's a self-defeating proposition. Sorry, you can't be right. Well, Immanuel Kant had the same problem. He says, well, we can't really know these things because we can't perceive them completely to be true. So are you, Mr. Kant, the only person who could properly perceive that to be true? But you say that nobody can perceive things to be true. So how are you right? See, it's very interesting that people make all these sorts of claims about what's